Hello, everybody. Whether you're listening to this on a nice Monday morning as it comes out or later in your week, thank you for being here. We released the first three episodes last week, and I was humbled by the response and how many people went and checked it out. I really appreciate you guys. And if you're here for the fourth episode, God bless you. You liked something about the first three, and that makes me very happy. Today, we're going to talk about something that I think is really important, journalism. We live in a country right now where the news is constantly being evaluated. How do we find good sources? What news sources do we believe? How do we even go about the process of deciding if something, if a source is credible, if a news outlet is credible? When we look at a story and then see news sources that have completely different perspectives. And so my guest today is Ivan Penn. Ivan has been a journalist his whole life. He currently is a writer for the New York Times, big time publication, big time journalist. And so I thought it would be awesome if we asked him those questions. What are we not seeing about the journalistic process? About how a story gets written, about the checks and balances, the ethics of all of it. And then I just simply asked him, how can we go about finding sources that we find to be credible in this crazy time? I hope you guys enjoy the chat. I think we have a lot to learn when it comes to this stuff. So let's dive in. Ivan, thanks so much for being here, man. The whole elephant. Welcome.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to join you.
What is COVID life like right now for a journalist? How has this thing been affecting you the last 9 months or so?
Well, the interesting thing was I was actually in New York when the shutdowns really started.
That's not a
Uh,
good place to be. That was not a good place to be.
no, but the one good thing is working for the New York Times. You get a lot of quick information. So as things began to shut down, the Times decided to have us all work remotely. So I got back on a plane to Los Angeles and been working from home since the middle of March. But I mean, I work from home a lot anyway. But now virtually the entire company is working from home, and that's it's a bit of a challenge when we like to be at the scene of stories that we're working on or
Sure.
talking to people in person. I've actually only gone out in this entire period for about 4 or 5 stories. So literally 4 or 5 times.
Wow.
Um, Everything else has really been working from home.
Yeah. Yeah. How has that been working? How was that supposed to work working for the New York Times? Were you traveling back and forth, splitting time? What was the plan?
So typically, because we have an office here in Los Angeles, and quite a few people work out of it. Two, maybe almost 3 dozen between our newsroom staff and our advertising business staff, and so we have an office to work out of. I'll go to New York a few times a year, usually spend about a week. Um, but most of my time is split between working in the LA office, working from home, and then traveling
Mm.
uh, to various places so my role is as the energy correspondent who covers renewable energy, heavily the electric grid, and utility companies all around the country. And then I work with some colleagues covering some stories around the world.
Mm.
My travel has been mostly in the U.S. And really sort of anywhere in the U.S. From the East Coast to the West Coast, and covering stories all across the country.
That's awesome. Uh, gonna get into journalism and what that means in this time right now and everything that's going on. But give me a little backstory. Did you always know that journalism was what you wanted to pursue, kind of as a kid? What's the backstory here?
So the Freudian analysis is, my father was a teacher, a school teacher, and retired as a school administrator, middle school. Both my parents were teachers, but my dad was a news junkie. Had copies of. I was born in Washington D.C. Grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland, the suburbs of D.C. We always had copies of the Washington Post on the coffee table. My dad would get home from work, and he'd turn on the evening news, so 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock news, the world news, Walter Cronkite, and all those
Sure.
guys. And
Back
then the
back when
11
there was
o'clock,
only like one or two options.
right? And so, like I said, Freudian analysis, would say it was a way to get attention from my dad. And actually it did. I in every level of school, I did something related to journalism. In elementary school, I was in the in-house cable program. I was a weatherman. In middle school, I worked on my yearbook. In
Recess is going to be indoors today.
it was funny because a weatherman in elementary school, and in high school and in college you do all kinds of things on the news organization. So I was both a news person in high school and the advertising manager, which
Nice.
is a real stark conflict of interest in the real journalism world.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But I play trumpet, but a career in trumpet playing wasn't. My father said, get your degree and then do whatever you want. But um, uh, it, I ended up focusing on a journalism degree, majored in journalism at the University of Maryland, and I was editor of the University of Maryland's newspaper, the Diamondback.
Mm.
One of the at the time was one of the wealthiest college newspapers in the country, independent of the university. Was run by a nonprofit called Maryland Media. I served on that board after college for a decade, and half of that time as the president of the board.
Mm.
Um, but as editor, I was the first African American editor in chief of the University of Maryland's newspaper. A really important thing for me because my dad, again, could not go to the University of Maryland College Park when he went to college because of segregation.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
he had to go to what was and it's a historically Black college and university, HBCU, then Maryland State, now the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, because he couldn't go to the College Park campus.
Mm.
And so my ability to actually be on that campus was sort of one level, but then they actually become the first Black editor in chief of the Diamondback. It was a really important part of my life. That paper, you as the editor in chief, you ran the show.
Yeah.
And everyone got paid. It sort of cemented my future in journalism. It led to an internship, well, to a couple of internships. One at a small paper that, at the time, very few people would have known anything about, but it became it drew national and really international attention. It was the Annapolis Capital newspaper, where there was a shooting, and several people, including a very close friend of mine, were killed in that shooting a couple of years ago. And then the Miami Herald was my my last internship, and they offered me a full-time job when I graduated from Maryland. And so I ended up there in South Florida, working for the Miami Herald. And that's how it all began. But it ended up being 5 different newspapers: Miami Herald, back to Maryland, worked for the Baltimore Sun, and came here to California on a journalism fellowship at Stanford, the John S. Knight Fellowship, and then went back to Florida, to the St. Petersburg Times, now the Tampa Bay Times, and then came back to California and worked for the LA Times, and have been here for 5 years. The New York Times hired me just almost 3 years ago from the LA Times, but based here in LA.
Early on in school and in those internships and stuff, who were the people that were kind of guiding you as far as how to do this right, the ethics, the standards of doing it? How did you learn those rules and guidelines along the way?
Well, there have been a lot of different people that had impact in different ways. My high school journalism teacher, Judy Adler, she was a real support in a lot of different ways, academically as well as journalistically. She took us to, not only did we do journalism right there in the classroom, but she took us to New York, to Columbia University. They had a high school journalism conference that she took us to. So we were really learning a lot of significant elements of how you approach journalism, from both the reporting and editing, those ethical standards and all, because we were not only doing it in just a high school classroom, but we were being exposed on really high levels. Especially Columbia University, which has an incredible journalism program, and was the source of a high school conference of real significance. And then, I was in the DC area, so you have the best of the best, all the major news organizations, print, radio, television. They're all there. Growing up, at a time of Watergate, and Carl Bernstein actually went to the University of Maryland. He worked on my college newspaper, the Diamondback. So we get a bit of claim to fame about Carl Bernstein of the Woodward and Bernstein fame. And then there were so both high school, college, we always talked about those iconic figures. And we saw ourselves in college not as college journalists, but non-commercial journalists, because we would never say that we were aspiring professionals. We were professionals. We just didn't work in the commercial world just yet.
Sure.
And there were a lot of people who were our heroes from the University of Maryland. So in addition to Carl Bernstein, Connie Chung did a little bit of work on our paper. As an African American, it was Dwayne Wickham, who was founder of the National Association, one of the founders of the National Association of Black Journalists, now the dean of the School of Communications at Morgan State University. And then you start going down the list, iconic now filmmakers. You have David Simon, who was the editor of the paper 10 years before me, has been a friend for a good while. We worked briefly together at the Baltimore Sun before he moved totally into TV and film. And so you have all these different major sort of characters, national characters, and you're learning both directly and indirectly from them. In that time that I worked with David, I worked with him on one story for a month, and I learned a lot of different journalistic tools from him. and ironically, two people who have not always gotten along, David and the person who hired me at the Sun, Bill Marimo. Uh, Bill was a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner. He spent a great deal of time with me directly. I was only a year out of college, had worked at the Herald again for a year, and Bill really spent a great deal of time with me when he brought me to the Baltimore Sun. But there are just a myriad of editors, a couple of professors in particular in college, Carl Stepp, and Eugene Roberts, who was considered one of the top 5 editors in the nation. He was
Yeah.
The editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer.
Right.
Good friends with Walter Cronkite. So these were people who were my teachers, my mentors, my editors, and just it became a long list, because now it's almost 3 decades in the journalism business, and
Yeah.
just incredible editors, co-workers, and I guess one other element there is, in journalism school there are one major course is on ethics,
Hmm.
and you go through what is the most significant Supreme Court case when it comes to journalism ethics, and that's New York Times versus Sullivan, which
Yeah.
is deals with libel
Right.
and what the elements are, and that's really drilled in your head. And so,
Right.
that's the
So that case it intrigues me because it basically said for libel, you not only have to prove that they lied, but that there was malice behind it, that there was ill intent.
well.
Is it a good decision? I guess should we? When I read about it, I feel like maybe we would be better as a society if it was a little stricter. You know what I mean?
Well, so it depends on who it is.
Okay.
That is the standard for public figures. For a non-public figure, it is a bit tighter.
Hmm.
Um, and I mean, you do have you have malice. You have the idea that it knowingly false. But again, those are standards for public figures. For a
Got it.
non-public figure, if you could damage that person's reputation with wrong information, and there not necessarily be malice or knowing falsehood involved, there are some things that can be done to remedy the mistake, but
Hmm.
in those cases, it's still, a jury may look at it when it comes to a non-public person that, that still was insufficient for the damage caused to that person's reputation.
Right. Right. Got it. Got it. So this podcast is called The Whole Elephant, based on the poem The Blind Man and the Elephant, where 6 blind men are asked to describe an elephant, and they all just describe it by the first body part they grab, right? So when we see your work, when we pick up, I was going to say when we pick up the paper, but I don't know that we do that. When we click the link to your work, especially someone listening to a podcast is probably not picking up the paper. When we read your work, we're only seeing the end product. That's the only perspective we get, the end product.
Sure.
Can you take us through how a story gets written from concept of, hey, I think there's a story here, to the page?
Sure. It's a mixed bag.
Mm.
There are, because there's different types of journalism, um, and a lot of times people don't understand how different the elements are. So, first of all, I'm a news reporter, a business news reporter, and which is very different from what people typically get really upset about, and that's the editorial side. The editorial board writes the opinions of the newspaper, and then there may be columnists who write their own opinion. I don't do that I write stories that, we deem quote unquote objective. Um,
Sure.
what our aim is to be fair, balanced, and accurate. And so when you are approaching the story, it may come from a lot of different standpoints. Maybe you just had an idea of something to write about because you saw something that looked interesting. So my beat again is energy. So maybe there's this massive solar farm that looks really, really interesting. Something about it is unique. Maybe the type of panels. So I just, that looks really weird. I'm going to find out about that and go and start talking to the people who own it. A story can, and they do begin that way. Sometimes it's someone calling and saying, hey, this is something that you might be interested in. And here's someone you can talk to about it. In another case, maybe it's a new, something that's brand new, and a company pitches it to you. It might not rise to the level of a story, but maybe it does. Maybe it's something that is really, really unique, and so you start asking questions. And then in some cases, your editor read something or saw something or just had an idea, his or herself, and the editor says, hey, why don't you check this out? So the story, the beginnings of a story come from a lot of different standpoints. The pursuit of the story is, you're looking at all of, for what is this? What are the pros and cons? So you're talking to people who both have perspectives on the pros and the cons of whatever the issue or the subject of the story is. And then you're at least, it's sort of classic, like you're writing a paper. The more sources you have, the more credible those sources are, the stronger your story. And then it goes to your editor. Typically, you have what we call the line editor, is your direct editor, and then it usually goes through at least one other person who's also, and it depends on the organization how that's structured, but somebody else who's maybe has not seen or been in conversations about the story to give a perspective that is fresh, also catches things, because our eyes, when we write something, our eyes don't always catch. We gloss over things that spell check and grammar check still miss.
Sure.
And so you have another set of eyes. On bigger stories, there might be 3 or 4 or more editors. If a controversial story, maybe senior editors. And in cases where it's investigative, that have serious implications on a company, an individual, it might you might have a consultation with a lawyer. What are the issues here? So it just depends on the story, the type of story, and where it originates, can vary.
Yeah. Have you had stories in your career where you've gone, I know this is true, but I don't have the sources, I don't have the facts to back it up, we can't run this?
Well, if it's at a place where it's written, then most likely you've already gotten to the place where, it's more, you might be arguing with your editor. Your editor might be saying, I don't think it's there yet.
There's not enough here. Yeah.
But if you've written it, or I guess if there might be a case where an editor changes something and you're arguing that's not accurate, and if you're saying that that's not accurate and it's your story, then an editor is not going to push something through that isn't accurate.
Right.
Um, and in the same token, um, if if you're not you're never in a place where um, you have to. I mean, you always feel pressure when you're approaching stories because you need to write something because that's your job, but you're also feeling a different type of pressure because it's not just uh, a handful of people reading your story, no matter
Sure.
what's your size of your organization. But
Right.
the
It's not like
bigger
this podcast. Only my mom is listening to this podcast. You write for way more people than this podcast.
well, it gets scary, especially because typically journalists, we're generalists. And
Sure.
I mean, there are some people who do have law degrees and medical degrees, and they specialize in law or covering medicine. But many of us are, majored in journalism or English, and
Right.
we're having to learn really complicated things. And and I've had I write about energy, so it's full of engineers and all, and we try to make a comparison to things that the average person can relate to, and I've gotten beaten up because of so the worst one was I was describing the difference in heat temperature in a story,
Yeah.
and it was like it was in Fahrenheit, and I said, well, it's about the same as the temperature you bake a cake, and the way I phrased it, the engineers jumped all over me. They were like, and the scientists and engineers, they jumped all over me. They're like, it's not 3 times as hot because that's not how it. I was like, oh man, they really tore into me.
I'm trying to make it palpable for the people. Come on.
And so, I mean, there's you have all these different kinds of challenges, but the main focus is how do I make sure that I'm fair, balanced, and accurate in what it is that I'm providing, because well, it's now, especially a place like the New York Times, this
Mhm.
is you consider the paper of record. And
Right.
so, even when we do make a mistake, we want to correct it because you want to make sure that the historical record reflects what is truth.
Right. Right. So you were educated. You had amazing mentors, both in school um, and early career, that taught you the ethics of this thing. And now you're at a paper that has the structure in place with editors and lawyers, and to keep kind of checks and balances and do the best you can to be ethical and truthful. And so how do you, through all of that, respond to the term fake news? Like what does that mean to you?
Well, everybody throughout history, people have challenged the media and newspapers. I said in a speech that you heard. Napoleon. Uh, he even said there's 4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're going back to bayonets. So you get the sense of how far back the hostility toward the media goes. And I mean, but not only the media as we know it now, but it's always been the messenger. Whoever the messenger is, people challenge the messenger.
Hmm.
And so that's maybe the terminology is new, but the premise behind it not so much.
Right.
The issues that are being raised right now, though, it have to do more with the kinds of questions that people are wrestling with are if in a democracy there is no source that we as a culture can universally turn to for accuracy and belief,
Yeah.
then what happens to our democracy? Um, and the whole idea of, because I remember I was actually back in college when they were literally talking about how news was going to change because of cable news,
Mm.
and how people would be. I mean, I was literally talking to an editor of I believe he was with Gannett at the time, and he was describing this thing to me. It was like, it's going to be, people will be able to find the news that they're particularly interested in, and at that point, I don't even know if he considered the ramifications of
Yeah.
of and the emergence of news tribalism that we have now, and like I said, the full implications of that. But it doesn't change what we do. Um,
Mm.
we need to educate people, but we've had that challenge for forever, as I mentioned. So the editorial boards, most people really don't understand that. I mean, I get a lot of people who say to me, well, you don't get to write you're dictated by, they tell you what you're going to write, and if you go against
Sure.
with that editorial board. And I'm like, no, it doesn't work like that. And
Mm.
we are separate entities. We don't collaborate, and, well, this is the opinion of the news organization. Like I said, I work for 5 different newspapers, and nobody has ever from an editorial board come to me and said, well, but this is our opinion, you can't write that story. It just doesn't work like that.
Mm.
And
It doesn't work like
but
that in places you've been, or it doesn't work like that in general? Because it seems like it works like that some places.
well, and so, and again, you've had dynamics change, but I've worked only at major news organizations.
Sure.
The Miami Herald, Baltimore Sun, Tampa Bay Times, LA Times, New York Times. These are major news organizations that don't get swayed by, like, advertisers. I've also had people say, well, um, they aren't going to let you write that because that will hurt your advertiser, and the advertisers will stop advertising.
Mm.
Well, the funny thing is, so there have been cases where I've written some stories that were critical of. I was at the Tampa Bay Times, and I wrote some stories that were critical of Home Depot and Nestle,
Mm.
and they actually, Nestle took out a full page ad, saying, but this is what we are doing. And, I mean, so it did actually stop them from advertising. They actually advertised. And I mean, and I've had that happen a few different times at different newspapers. So it wasn't actually people bosses saying we can't do that story. It was,
Right.
I mean, it just
That's
it
amazing.
just doesn't work like that. I mean, small news organizations, a small town newspaper
Mhm.
whose bread and butter depends on those local people. Yeah, there are stories about some small town newspapers being influenced, but
Right.
then there are also there's some real gritty small town papers that just try to work to get the truth out there.
Yeah.
So, it does vary, but not with the major news organizations.
Got it. Got it. I have heard you speak a couple times, and your opening line is "There are those who want me dead," which is like that's a total boss opening line. First of all, like as somebody listening, I'm like, oh man, that's a great opening line. But been the fact, that's been reality for you. Uh, what are those times like when you write something where somebody is not going to be happy?
Yeah, and it varies because there's sometimes when I'm not anticipating that someone's going to be that bothered by something.
Mm.
But there are times when it's like this is really going to make somebody unhappy,
Yeah.
um, and it's hard. It depends on the level of reaction. So I've in one case, uh, people got on TV and said, and a person said of me and a colleague who wrote this story, um, if we see these punks, we're going to deal with these. We're going to deal with these punks the way Druid Hill deals with them. Well, the question was, what does that mean? I
Yeah.
mean, there's an implied threat, but it was unclear what that threat was. Um, it was given enough weight that my editors at the time, they offered to move me and my family, to
Wow.
actually put us up somewhere else. We decided not to do that, but they did have a police car sit outside of our home for several days.
Mm.
Um, and so when it's that level, it's really it's unsettling, it's scary. At another news organization, I got some threatening phone calls. So they gave me, they couldn't do much more, but they gave me, a pepper spray stick.
Yeah.
And I mean, the fact that you have that, you know, there's the security of having something, and then the insecurity of the fact that you need to have something.
Totally. You mentioned earlier that you had friends in the Baltimore newspaper shooting. Is that is it a constant fear? Is it a fear sometimes? Just the fact that you work in an organization that even if you aren't necessarily making people mad, that stuff is being written that's going to make people mad. Is that a constant fear, or is that something that pops up in certain situations? What has that been like over the years?
Well, it's varied. So, I mean, you had these periods where, people were mailing things to newsrooms and to government officials.
Mm.
Um, Sometimes just a white powder, sometimes actual, some kind of actual poison. Um,
Mm.
and then you have the shooting, you have the threats that come in, because depending on the news organization, you have people writing things on all levels. Things that are, I mean, I've written stories that have gotten people indicted, cost people their jobs. That you're very cognizant of the impact that your words are having,
Mm.
because they're not small things. You're talking about people's livelihoods. You're talking about their ability to take care of themselves, their families, and you're also talking about the potential of somebody actually going to prison. Um, and 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 you have to be cognizant of those things. I mean, even if they are determined to in fact be guilty, you're recognizing, you have to recognize that this is a human being, and what these implications are, even if they did it to themselves. um you're if they have a family, their spouse, their children, to just ignore those things would be in the on the other side inhuman.
Yeah.
um, so you're cognizant of the impact on yourself, the threats to yourself, but also the impact that this is having on the people that you're reporting on, and
Sure.
it's why, regardless of what some critics may say, you are really thinking about being accurate in what you're doing, because you can face lawsuits. I mean, I had someone bring a lawsuit that got thrown out against me and a colleague, not for the accuracy of the story, but because of the reporting techniques that they accused us of using.
Yeah.
And so, you face legal ramifications, like lawsuits or protecting your sources. We will always protect our sources. That could lead us being held in contempt of court if
Mm-hmm.
if a court starts demanding we reveal our source. Well, we're concerned about their safety and their
Sure.
job and their families. So there's legal issues on all sides and livelihoods and all.
Has social media kind of been a double-edged sword with that? I mean, pros and cons. We get news instantly in our hands. We get updates on things happening right when it happens, but we kind of also sidestep some of those processes of thinking how it's going to affect people, checking accuracy, things like that. Has social media been a problem in that realm?
Well, social media, I mean, it's changed so many different aspects of the work that I know I do. I mean, as social media unfolded, you had to begin to establish what the rules are for journalists. I mean, within your organization, because you don't want to give any indication that you have a um, that you're not reporting on things fairly. So, news organizations had to determine, well, what's permissible for our journalists to do and what's not,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
uh, and and then how people react to your stories. There are a lot of times you have to be careful how you respond, even just on your own story, more or less on issues that are going on. So, for instance, you write something about, I've written something about, you go on Twitter, because of the space that I'm in, the energy space, there are times I write about Tesla. And there are those who love Tesla, love Elon Musk, and there are
Mm.
those who hate Tesla and hate Elon Musk. And so if you write something that is that has maybe a sort of a positive spin for whatever reason,
Yeah.
then those who hate Tesla, I've had them come at me, and then written something critical of Tesla, and those who love Tesla, they come after me. I mean, and it can be such a barrage of responses, because especially Twitter, that people fire off,
Yeah.
and it can be overwhelming, because in early in my career, okay, someone would write a letter to the editor.
Right.
And, the letter's got to get there. And so, and so it's like, maybe they would pick up the phone and call.
Yeah.
But, typically, people would write letters and snail mail. And so it's like days before you actually get the feedback. Now,
Right.
the moment the story posts, it's people are responding, because and especially if they're in the space you're in, because they have put in a some kind of notification somewhere on the internet to say, if the name of my organization comes up, then
Right.
they get instant feedback, so they can instantly feedback on the story. So
Right.
yeah, it's
Right.
changed a lot of things.
So, I struggle with knowing what news outlets to trust and not trust. And, something happens and you can pull up two stories on the exact same event that make it look like two completely different things. So I know we don't want to talk about like specific organizations or anything like that, but what would be your advice to me as I try to navigate what stories are true, what news outlets to read. I mean, aside obviously the LA Times, we gotta read the LA Times. But how do I navigate that? How do I find those reliable sources?
Well, this again uh, goes back to even what we just do in the classroom. I mean, not even on just the collegiate level, but in virtually every part of our educational system, where we're taught to look at to consider the source, and that, I mean, that goes for every story. And look, it's not to say that there aren't bad apples. Just as, I mean, it's human beings, and among us are people who don't do things the way the way they should be done. And then, any of us can also make a mistake. But the big thing is, and that includes even in choosing a source. Maybe we didn't vet that source enough.
Sure.
But as a reader, I should be doing the same basic thing that we're taught in school. You know, what sources are you using to write that paper? Are they good, credible sources? And 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 then we might think that they are, and then we discover that even that they're not. But look at the story, look at the standards that that organization has.
Mm.
And I mean, we all have to also look within ourselves. A big part of the trouble is, we a lot of times approach things like a sporting event. Um, I'm I'm a fan of this team, and
Mm.
you're a fan of that team. You
Right.
you can't talk about my quarterback. I know my quarterback is awful, but I can talk about my quarterback. You can't talk about my quarterback. Um, and,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and that's the way we are now approaching everything in
Yeah.
our society. When the reality is, there are standards that we know help us to evaluate the quality. I mean, to use the sports analogy in the quarterback, I mean, there's an easy way to determine, well, how good is that quarterback really? Well, look at the person's stats, and how
Right.
do those stats match up to what we've seen from great quarterbacks? I mean,
Right.
a lot of this stuff is not really that hard. But if I don't want to hear that,
Right.
if I don't want to believe it, then it doesn't even matter.
Yeah.
But we look at the standards, and the standards of places, and I can speak mostly, obviously, about print journalism, but the standards of the New York Times, the standards of the LA Times, the standards of the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. These organizations have very, very high standards, and there are real legal re- requirements to the approaches. Because again, the New York Times versus Sullivan, you can't just make stuff up. And I mean,
Right.
not on the news side. But again, part of that is an onus on news organizations to help educate the public, because the opinions the opinions of the news organization or the opinion of a columnist has nothing to do with what a news reporter uh,
Mm.
presents. That they're very, very different. But I'll be in a conversation with someone, and they're like, well, I just can't stand this, that, or the other, and it's so biased. And I'm like, well, what are you talking about? Well, such and such a columnist. I'm like, well, but that's their job, is to write an opinion.
That's an
And
opinion. Yeah. Yeah.
and most of the major news organizations, they have, even the individual columnists. There are liberal and conservative columnists,
Mm.
and
Hmm.
you can find them at virtually every news organization. So, it's a real consider the source,
Gotcha.
evaluate, and both the organization and the story itself,
Yeah.
because some stories aren't good. And sometimes, an individual reporter may generally write really good, strong stuff, and maybe this particular story wasn't sourced well. I mean,
Sure.
it
Sure.
happens. We're human.
Awesome. Well, I mean, before we jump to this next part, I just got to say, man, it's crazy, media and news and stuff like now. There's so much going on and so many opinions. The fact that you are there writing, and I know who you are, and I know it gives me hope that there are more people like you that are out there writing. So I appreciate that you're out there doing that, man. I want to this last little section here. Part of this podcast is my own trying to figure out my faith journey. God, faith, spirituality, why are we here? All of those questions. And I like to just kind of leave it open-ended and see where you're coming from, either how you grew up, where you're at now. What does all that mean to you? God, faith, spirituality, those sorts of things.
Well, what was interesting. So yeah, in addition to the fact that my parents were teachers, um, they also were leaders in the church that I grew up in. It's a Pentecostal church in D.C. And because my parents were educators, they led the Sunday school in our church. They led the vacation Bible school, and um, and then broadly, I mean, my whole family is full of pastors, worship leaders, singers, musicians, uh, educators in not only secularly but also theologically. Um, so it's just prolific in my family, and so that's the environment that I grew up in. And people would ask me, especially as I was pursuing the journalism career, well, how can you be a journalist and a person of faith?
Mm.
And I was able very early on to uh, at least answer that question, because I heard an interview with a journalist who was a Christian, and his response to that question was, how could I not be a Christian? The requisite elements of being uh, both are that you be fair, balanced, and honest.
Mm.
Um, and so they both actually dovetail.
Yeah.
Um, and so that was an important thing to me. Now, there are some of these other elements that really sort of play on the faith components, because I mentioned about the being cognizant of the impact of your stories,
Yeah.
um, and when you look at from a faith standpoint, you know everybody, all human beings, to a greater or lesser degree, um, have flaws, and none of us are perfect,
Yeah.
and that's a bit of the we'll put on facades, even in communities of faith, deifying others or ourselves even. And the
Yeah.
reality is, we all have flaws, and so I'm very cognizant of that, probably at a higher level than maybe some,
Yeah. I mean,
because
it's empathy.
yeah, I mean, it's just a pure recognition, you know but for the grace of God, so go I. um
Yeah.
and
Well, I know that I certainly have had episodes in my life that I would not want written about and put in a newspaper.
sure, and then
We all
some,
do.
yeah, and in some cases, people are, we're putting them under a microscope that is
Mm.
really significant. Um, but I cannot. I mean, in as much as I grew up with that journalism bent, I equally grew up with the faith side. I mean, and as much as that newspaper was on the coffee table, so was the Bible.
Mm.
Um, and we were in Sunday school every Sunday, and we were in the choir, and both, whether it was singing or as a musician or whatever. And so those things are real parts of my life. Now, I have some of the newspapers I've been at. Um, the senior managers have led prayer groups,
Mm.
um, and in one case, uh, the I mean they didn't have them. There was a local church near the office, and people would meet before work. If I remember correctly, it was like every Wednesday. Um, and it got to the place where, there was like 30, 40 people um, gathered for, um, a, a prayer at like 7 o'clock in the morning. Um, and so, yeah, there's a lot of people of faith and of different faiths. I mean,
Yeah.
Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, and so I mean, within news organizations, and so it's not, a faithless bunch of people.
Mm.
In fact, I know a lot of people who are who are believers in their faith, and their faith is really, really important to them. Um, every news organization I've worked for has uh, given space to our faiths and make it clear as on in some areas where people will socially disagree, but in as much as not discriminating on race or gender or sexuality even, they make it adamant we will not discriminate based on people's faiths either,
Yeah.
um, and are very respectful of people's faiths. I mean, and of course, there are those who are not. I mean, but that's again, we're not homogenous. I mean,
Right.
different people have different views, but organizationally allow for it and support it, and those are things that I'm grateful for.
Yeah, we have different views, but also, in the Venn diagram of the religions, it seems like across pretty much all religions, helping the poor, protecting the weak, telling the truth, those things that you hold valuable in your job, it seems like that's a big part of a lot of religions. Do you feel like you have connected with people of other faiths in your job because of those truths?
Yeah, the, the real great thing about what I do is, I my job is to talk to people, and regardless of who they are, and regardless of whether I agree with them or don't disagree with them, it doesn't make any difference. So I've been in synagogues and mosques and churches, and I mean, and just to hear people's hearts. I mean, yeah, you have extremists in every area, but
Mhm.
there are the average person. Yeah, I mean, and in the media and outside of me, I mean, people just want they want community and love, and they
Yeah.
and they want to get rid of the things that are disrupting that.
Right. And if if I'm going to critique the modern church and Christianity at all, uh, it's it's becoming too much of a tribe. We're not taking the time to look out and see other people and other faiths. We are building walls and protecting our quarterback, to go back to that analogy. And man, just having a little bit of empathy and reading a little bit more broadly and meeting your neighbors, there's just so much more that we have in common than we differ, I think.
We're yeah, but it requires listening, and
Yeah.
we're which is a that's a beautiful skill of journalists. And then when we apply it even in our personal lives, it becomes a really important tool in our marriages and in our
Mm.
families and in our communities. Just listening to people and hearing their perspective. That these things are just important skills for us as human beings. We're not going to all agree. I mean, I've been married for 23 years, and I mean, that you're not going to agree on everything, and you also know that they learn that you can't change another person, and you learn you can't change another person. You begin to
Sure.
accept that, you know what, I've got to respect you for you, and
Mm.
not for what I think you should do. Be I've got to learn to respect you for you, and learn to respect myself for who I am,
Yeah.
and that that all of that is okay, and the rest of it, we love each other in such a way that it inspires. We inspire each other to be the best version of ourselves. I mean, that's not always what I grew up in church.
Right.
I mean, it was do this or you're going to hell. I
Right.
mean,
No, totally.
and
Totally.
but the reality is, it's just saying, hey, if we can love people in a way that inspires them to be the best version of themselves, I think that that's what God is looking for us to do.
Well, we're out of time, man, but I so appreciate you taking the time to do this. This is when I wrote down my first wave of people I want to do it. You were at the top of the list because journalism, media, it's crazy right now. And I wanted to have this conversation. And so I appreciate you taking the time, man. I really do.
Well, I appreciate the invitation. Appreciate the invitation.
All right. Thanks, my man.